All right, welcome everyone. We are here for our first guest speaker talk. We have John Fielding here with us. And John got his start as a previs animator at the Third Floor. And after working there for over 3.5 years on over 16 films, he made the jump into the freelance world of final animation. For about 5 years, he worked on keyframe and mocap projects between studios like Psyop, Blur, and Frame Machine. He worked on a ton of different advertising campaigns like Clash of Clans, video game cinematics like Halo Wars 2, and the first season of Love, Death, and Robots, before landing at The Mill, where he became a lead animator, mostly leading the Apex Legends launch trailers. And last year, John made the next big jump in his career by joining Epic Games. John, welcome. We're glad you're here.
Hi, thanks. Glad to be here. Glad to share all of my experience with you guys. I guess we should just dive into it, yeah?
Yep, the floor is yours. You have sharing capabilities. You should be able to do whatever you need.
Y'all can see that, I assume.
Yep, we're good.
Click some more buttons. Cool. All right. Well, welcome to Transitioning to Animating an Engine. With this presentation, I'm going to be giving you guys a brief overview of everything I think you need to know to make transitioning into animating in Unreal as smooth as possible. I myself only just made this transition last fall. So it's all still quite fresh and new to me. And one thing that's always important to keep in mind is, like, I'm pretty sure we only just released animation tools in version 5.1. So it's all very new and it's constantly evolving. So, have some patience with it and know and trust that we have an awesome team of people working on tools, and it's going to get just better and better with every new release. So Brian just gave a quick overview of me, so I can skip over most of that. But I did want to note that in the 13 years, I've worked in Maya, Motion Builder, XSI. I've even done a small project in Cinema 4D. I've done my own personal explorations in Blender. So I'm coming at this from a headspace of I've seen a bunch of different softwares, and I know kind of what's similar and what's going to be different in each one of them. But it's awesome that you guys are all here, because it shows that you guys know the same tip that I was taught early on, is to always be willing to adapt to new software. Because Unreal, from what I hear from my freelance friends, is very much on the cutting edge and becoming more and more of a common thing that you're going to need to know how to use. So you guys are all in a good position. Let's get to the next one. So much like moving to any other package, any other software, it's going to be a lot of similar stuff and some different stuff. But if you're like a simple, low-tech, old-school animator that's just like, hey, how do I pose the character? How do I hit save? How do I make a keyframe? You have all that. But it's just a matter of where's the buttons. If you're a more advanced animator like me, like I used to do a lot of scripting and tool stuff in Maya, you'll find it's a little bit of a harder transition. You can't just bring all the tools that you're used to having. It's also really hard to write tools, but we do have actually a lot of really good basics that that you don't find in other packages, which is great. Because writing tools is pretty. Sorry for all the. I don't know how to mute that. We'll have all the stuff you need. You'll be able to make constraints. You'll have actually a tween slider, which is great. Pose library. All this stuff built in. Please stop digging. Sorry. And so you will probably feel a little bit slower, right? Because there's just a lot to learn. This isn't you have to also remember, this isn't a animation first software. This is very much a software that's existed for many, many years, and they're rolling in animation features. So you're going to be a little bit slower up front. You're going to have some trouble with the UI. Like, it kind of reminds me of back in the day with Blender. Blender was so different from other packages. You'd open it and be like, I don't even know how to move around. I'm just spinning this cube. This is confusing, and close it. Similarly, you're going to open Unreal and be like, where's the timeline? How do I do anything? It's going to be very confusing. And it will take a lot of tuning. You're going to have to embrace learning the software. And unlike stuff like Maya, you can't, and I don't think you should rely on like the built-in hotkeys, because they're not necessarily designed across the whole software experience for animation friendliness. So get used to the settings and be ready to tune everything as you need it. So let's just jump in. So what's the same? There's a viewport. So yes, as with any package, you're going to be able to see a viewport. And actually out the gate, the way you can navigate and tumble around, you have the same basic Maya ones. The only difference is that the middle mouse button to pan is inverted, but you can quickly fix that setting and you can navigate like normal. So there's nothing kind of weird there. But what is a little different is also the viewport, because this is a game engine first. You can use like mouse and keyboard style inputs, so like the WASD buttons and just moving your mouse around to fly around your scene, which could be cool if you're doing previs. You could probably really scout out a scene really quickly, which is cool. Animating as like a character animator, it's a little awkward. I don't use it. I'm also not a mouse and keyboard video gamer, so it's not natural to me. But you know what? There might be on the top right here, it's all pixelated. There is a there's a setting here for the scale of your camera on the top right there. So you could play with that value to why did they do that? You could play with that value to change how much your camera is moving, and maybe you could find that it works for you really well to move around your character. So that's kind of part of embracing the newness of the software and kind of trying to think outside of the box. And this is the editor preferences panel. It's a little overwhelming at first. There isn't, like in Maya, you have like that nice, neat like keyboard mapping, and you can like type in a command and you can see what everything is bound to. It's not like that. This is the hotkeys and the settings and the preferences all in one spot. So it can be like hard to find stuff, but also everything is set up. Every panel basically has its own different set of hotkeys. So it's not like you're going to stomp on other important things very easily. And here I'm just kind of going through some important settings. I have a slide on the next one that I think you guys should all take a quick screenshot of. Because these are just basic navigation ones that we recommend you guys swap over. But you can see that you just start to type in roughly what the command is, and it will auto filter down to the thing. But you can see even here, like with the left drag marquee, that's a different setting per each different editor, which can be kind of tricky at times, but also it's kind of nice because, again, you're not going to stomp on top of settings for other things very easily. And those recommended viewport settings are right here. Invert the middle mouse, so it's like normal Maya. Enable the arc ball, that's for rotating. By default, you can only grab the handles, so it makes rotating stuff kind of tricky. Enable screen rotate. Left mouse does drag marquee. That's just literally like, otherwise you're going to left mouse in the viewport and you're going to start zooming around like you're flying around a camera. But another big thing, so you have your viewport. Now you need to like make like save a file, right? The file system in Unreal is super different from, it took me a long time to kind of wrap my head around. because like in Maya, you take it for granted, you open up Maya, there's your stuff, and you go and you just hit save and you're saving what you're looking at. But in here, it's more like you open up Unreal and you're in a level, right? That's what this thing says, new world. It's technically labeled as a level, right? Everything happens inside of a level, but what you put in that level is saved to that level. It's kind of like referencing in your environment, but it's always there. The level sequence is actually where you're going to do your work. That's what's going to save all of your keyframes. So you kind of have to think of a level sequence as your Maya scene file. That's might not be technically accurate, but that's the way that I've come to understand it, and it makes the most sense to me. Now, depending on the pipeline of what you're working in, you may or may not need this animation sequence. I'm not doing linear content. I'm only doing gameplay, so this is important aspect. This animation sequence is the actual file that gets plugged into the engine. So anytime you hit save on your level sequence, it's generating these animation sequences. And these are a bunch of jargony terms, but this is essentially the same thing as your FBX export, right? It just happens automatically. You don't have to run a tool to export your stuff. You just hit save and it kicks it out if you've set everything up correctly. But yeah, so you're going to open up Unreal and you're going to like, where is my timeline? I'm an animator. I need a timeline. How do I animate? Where is this? Where is this? Where is this? Oh, it's something called a sequencer. So you can go in and you can, under Windows, you can find sequencer and you can open it, but it's just going to be blank. And you're like, but still, where's my timeline? You literally have to create a file, right? So this is a little confusing, but you can just go into the content browser, which is down here on the bottom, navigate to a directory that you want to work in, right click, and it's under cinematics, and you'll find level sequence. And now you have a level sequence. So now when you double click on that to open it, there's your timeline. But that seemed like a lot of work just to get a timeline, which is a little confusing. But that timeline is saving all of the keyframes and all of the characters and stuff that are associated with that file. And what that lets you do is you can, as a gameplay animator, I could be working in a default level that's just very bare bones and plain, and I can reopen my animation in like a specific level from the game. So the modularity of that is actually pretty handy. But one thing to note, that if you open up a file browser, everything is labeled .uasset. So the level sequence, the animation sequence, everything is going to look exactly the same. It's not like Maya where you're going to have .mb and .fbx and all these, like, you can quickly see what's an export and what's a Maya file. It's going to be really hard. So that's where you're going to need to be very specific about where you're saving, or really just hope that your pipeline and tools kind of manage all of that stuff well for you, because you can't just like go into the file browser and find stuff very easily. It's also there's going to be a lot of stuff revolving around Perforce and file check-ins and checkouts, and I'm just assuming you're going to get that covered in the other classes. Already did that. Come over here. So another kind of same but different is the widgets, right? So you're going to have the same, translate, rotate, scale, but they're going to look a little different. The paddle's not going to be out here for like that single axis. It's just going to be here near the center point. The rotation tool is very different from Maya, where like in Maya, I don't know if you can, hopefully you can see my mouse. You would usually like spin, right? That arc around. Well, right now our rotate tool, you click and you pull. It's called like a pull string, which I'm not the biggest fan of, but in the future, I've seen there are plans to kind of give better options for how that operates. Translates now called location. Rotates aren't XYZ, they are roll, pitch, and yaw, which is pretty confusing at first, but once you start having like good rigs, you'll start to understand, like, because it is like an airplane, right? You have your pitch, you have your roll, and you have your yaw. And then when you're animating and you're like, oh, I need to tweak the character to move like this, it's going to be more clear to you, oh, it's the yaw, not Z or X. Like, that doesn't always make sense. So that takes a bit of getting used to, but the same order here, X, Y, Z, they're the same colors. So this is still red, green, and blue. So it'll look similar, but it'll be a little confusing probably. Another thing to note is, I don't know if you guys do this, but one of my favorite parts of Maya is the indirect manipulation, right? It only works on translate and scale, unless you're like me and you make a specific hotkey to pick axes. But in Maya, you could just use, if any axis is selected, you can just use middle mouse and it'll move. You don't have to go to the thing and click on it. Or you could hold down shift and just drag in a direction. It'll start moving in that direction. We have that in Unreal, but it's actually, you can't do that with the rotation tool in Maya, but you can in Unreal, right? You can do what's called indirect manipulation. Your mouse doesn't have to be on top of the handle to move it. Your mouse could be wherever you want it to be in the viewport. And you just hold down Control with either left, right, or left plus right, and that'll do X, Y, or Z. Oh, and that's a pretty cool feature that you can do that for both translates and rotates and scales and all that stuff. Because I mean, I personally really don't like that I have to like drag my mouse all the way over to click a handle just to move it up. I want to just move. I want things to connect to my brain more. So it's great that we have that. So kind of covered, you make that level sequence, it gives you a sequencer. Sequencer is your home as an animator. Everything that's relevant to you is inside of the sequencer, like in terms of the assets you're going to touch and the things you're going to animate. This is where your keys live. This is where constraints show up. This is like the home base. And it's kind of like a lot of different things. So it's kind of like the dope sheet. So in the dope sheet, if you select some controllers, you can see there's like this top level track there's a key on this frame somewhere. Or you can open it up and you can see each individual controls track. Well, that's what the clip in the sequencer does by default. So you can see here, I'm toggling open. This purple thing is the main animation track for the whole control rig. So anywhere before that opened up, if you see right here, anywhere that there's a dot, that means there's a keyframe somewhere on that frame on the rig. You can spin it open and you can see each individual controller's key tick marks, expand that to see each individual attribute's key tick marks. Personally, I don't work with this stuff. This is data that doesn't mean anything to me down here, but this top level track I find is super helpful when this is collapsed. You can just like select, and you don't have to do a big drag select or make sure you're selecting all the controls in your rig, because it's all bundled into this control rig track. You can move those keys and retime your stuff really easily. I liken this feature kind of like the action editor in Blender, in the same way that there's like the individual timings versus like the overall timings, and it's really great to be able to quickly select. There's already hotkeys for like select from here forward or here back, to just quickly retime your animation globally. It's also kind of like the time editor in Maya. This is also where you'll go. You can pull in different animation clips, like different mocap clips, and drag them into each other to blend them, similar to the time editor, and also Motion Builder story editor. There is motion matching, so you can right click on the clip and tell it which joint to match across the two clips. It's all very similar to each other in that regard, and it looks a lot more like the story editor in Movu. But that's all there. There's also a part of the sequencer that's the camera. It's like the camera sequencer, or like the director track in the story editor. You can see a nice little thumbnail preview of the shot's start and end frames, which is really cool. You can tweak the editing points. Each of these are assigned to different cameras. You pull in the cameras. So that's all pretty cool. It's all right here in your view, in your sequencer. Anything that has this lightning bolt stays in your file. So you want to have that lightning bolt. It's called spawnable. That means it'll persist when you reopen this file like later. One difference I will caveat with this editing style versus Maya's, I personally came to really grow to love this really ugly camera sequencer in Maya, because this sequencer has a different timeline than the Maya straight time. So you can see if I'm playing the playhead through across here, it's going to hit frame 21 and then it's going to jump back to frame 2. So you can actually have non-linear edits in Maya. You can't do that straight away in here in UE, but if you start doing something called subsequences, which is like a more advanced thing, you can like make a whole scene and then chop that scene up, and you can do the non-linear edits that way, which is still pretty cool. So the basics of the top of the sequencer bar. These are the bits that you need to care about. This button here is the save button. There are save buttons in other places in the UI. None of them are as important as this. This is the button you want to be hitting. This button triggers, if you have any what's called linked animation sequences, this will trigger that export of that animation sequence file. This will save whatever is set as a spawnable in your level sequence. So that's the main button to hit there. If you're doing linear content and stuff, I'll cover this later, but this button here for the camera will actually just create a camera track for you, which is quick and easy. This eyeball is a bunch of little viewing options that you can tune. So like in here, you can see this gray bar. I don't really like looking at that. It doesn't, to me, it's not information that helps me. So it's called layer bars or something like that. You can turn that off. So you can kind of fine tune what information is displayed to you and how it all kind of acts, which is nice. This button here is obviously the keying options. This top section is kind of important to note. By default, I believe it's set to key changed, which is similar to Maya's auto key. I mean, you can change these settings in Maya too, right? So like if you touch a control, like if you touch one clean axis, it will just key that axis. If you do key all, it's going to key, I haven't tested this because it's the way that I like to work, but I think key all is going to key either every axis or it's going to key the entire character rig. And key group, I'm assuming key group and key all are actually similar to motion builders like parts and stuff. But I think that requires certain things to be set up for the group to work. You're going to see a bunch of this is all basically auto tangent, but just like slightly different ones. This user tangent, it doesn't it just means you've touched a tangent handle. So I don't know what setting that as your default would do, but this is where you would also set the default style of key you want to have set. And here's a good old auto key button. Make sure that's on. This is how you're going to get into your curve editor. There's no separate Windows graph editor kind of a thing that pops up through this. This is our graph editor. It's called curve editor. And a quick little simple note is if you're not sure which level sequence you have open, it's right here on the right hand side. So because that can actually get kind of confusing at times. So then, like I showed before, this can get stacked up pretty quick, especially once you have, where's the camera sequencer? When you have this, so you're gonna have the camera cuts, you're gonna have the camera actors, you're gonna have the rig, you're gonna have all of this stuff. It can get cluttered really quickly. You can hit Control G and get folders on accident, mostly. But that's not the same as actually if you right click on any track, right? You can add to group. So you can create specific groups. So this mannequin asset has multiple animation tracks in here, the control rig track and the transform track. I can put just this control rig track into a group. And then when I click that little filter button and it gets slightly more highlighted, now my sequencer only shows that. Everything else still exists. It all persists. I could turn off that filter and everything comes back. But now I have a much cleaner, simpler, less overwhelming sequencer to look at than just animating and working on keys. So if you open the curve editor, it's down here, right? So this is the sequencer curves. It looks as you expect, It's like I was saying before. Now you know how to set keys. Now you can see a graph editor. A lot of you can probably check out at this point. It's not animation can get more complicated than that, but that's the bare bones of what you need to animate. But I will note, this graph editor will fill up with anything that you have selected up here. So if I select this control rig track, it will by default show you all of the curves in your curve editor. Even if you start selecting just certain controllers in your rig in the viewport, they will all still show until you deselect this by hitting like escape or something inside of this window. But once you've done that, it will start to, like, depending on your settings here, it'll auto scroll it to that controller. You can see it's the same here, same here. And so is there anything else on this? Yeah. So, but one thing to note that's a pretty hard transition is in Maya, there's all those nice little, you can use a channel box to just kind of quickly filter curves. We're working on a similar feature, but you can't do that yet. So you have to do a lot of scrolling over here and clicking to get to the individual curve, which is kind of a bummer. But, you know, this is showing you can do all the same basics you need to do: select keys, set different tangent types, break the tangent types. One thing that's unique to Unreal is you can mix weighted and unweighted keys. Like in Maya, that's like a whole curve option. Either the entire curve is weighted or the entire curve is non-weighted. But if for some reason you wanted weighted curves or weighted keys, or maybe you only needed one key that you just wanted to set that weighted and pull the handle over, you can do it and mix and match on one function curve, which is pretty unique and cool. There are also like 1,000 different ways to scale keys. It's kind of overwhelming, and surprisingly, none of them are as simple as like the basic Maya scale key. But you can see here, this is like similar to the regions select key. So in Maya, you know, you select some keys, the region scale tool, you can pull on any side and it scales on that side of the box. Except ours has a pivot point, and you can place that pivot point specifically. You can set the value you want it. You can pull it toward one of the bars, and it'll kind of snap to that bar. So it's a few more clicks if you want to do this style scaling, but it does give you even more precision, which is kind of nice. We also have time bars, much like Maya's. There's some quirks with it. You can't do the retime where it doesn't affect the keys, and you can't grab that bar at the top to select them. But overall, it functions basically the same as what you have in Maya. It's just a little different. Same with everything in this whole talk. And here's like the basic Maya scale, right? Wherever you click, you use the scale tool and you just middle mouse and it scales from that pivot point. Again, we don't have that. There's this other one that is actually scaling each curve on its own independent track based on the pivot type that you pick here. So you could pivot from the first key, the last key, the bounding box, but our keys draw outside of where there's a key. So like in Maya, the curve stops getting drawn at this point. So you know that's the end of any key. So this keeps going, but you'll see first key, this Y value here only has a key in these two frames. So its pivot points are different from the pivot points that end up over here. Technical nonsense, really overwhelming. There's a ton of different ways to scale, but none of them are going to be your familiar Maya scale. So that's the basic thing to take note. Another thing that's kind of same but different is we do have animation layers. They're called sections, and you can just access them by hitting that little plus sign, or sometimes when you hover over, it'll show add section. Click additive. But kind of like in Motion Builder, or if you're doing animation layers in a time editor in Maya, they're tracks, they're clips. So you have to drag the clip to fit the range that you're working in. But it's there, and once you select it, it'll have like a slight green highlight around it, and it's going to start setting keys inside of there. You can more explicitly right-click and say key this section, and it'll start keying that section. So boom, you can see there's this absolute track. I don't know what that is. It's not the same as Maya's override track. I tried to get answers on that. I still don't understand what that is. So I would just avoid it and just use additive. And that's basically it. And this is where we start to separate ourselves from the rest of the softwares out there. No other software I've opened has the amount of tools built into it that Unreal has, which is really cool. So once you go into what's called animation mode, so similar to Maya, you have a component mode or whatever, or like Blender is much more analogous here. Like Blender, you have to go into pose mode to touch a controller, to move a controller. That will happen automatically if you select a track that has a control rig in the sequencer, or you can on the top left pick animation mode. Then this bit right here, this panel here on the left pops up. I just, for demonstration purposes, to pull out all of those tools into one image. But in here, this is like the select button, kind of like in Maya, how you're always accidentally selecting geometry. Turn this on, whoop, go back. Turn this on, and you won't be able to select anything that's not a control rig. So that's kind of nice and easy. Poses here opens up a built-in pose library. I know I think Maya used to have some stuff like this, but this just works. It's easy, it's straightforward. You can mirror stuff, you can set keys, you can use it as a selection set basically. So whatever gets stored into the clip, those controllers are selected. You can paste the pose. It captures a thumbnail so you know what you're going to get. So it's all pretty straightforward and pretty easy. The snapper tool, it's kind of like, some people don't like to use constraints. And you just want to like align things on some certain frames. So you can define a frame range. You can define if you want to keep the offset or not. Just snap position rotation, and boom. It's pretty straightforward. You pick the thing, you click the child, and then the thing you want it to follow. You select it, and then you click that button, and then it'll just kind of bake it out basically on every frame in that range. We have motion trails. Once this is on, it's only going to be putting the motion trail for what you have selected, but you can right click on that curve and pin it so that when you select something else, it'll still be visible. Same kind of basic settings as you see in Maya. So this is all pretty straightforward and easy. Oh, I skipped over tweens. Yes, so between poses and snapper was tweens. Sorry. This is really cool. So this is our little built-in tween tool. By default, we have the basic tween, you have blend and neighbors and push pull. I always suggest you leave tween alone because tween is terrible. Blend and neighbors is so much better. It takes into account where you currently are, blends to or away. And you don't have to pay a subscription service to get this. It just comes in our software, which is really cool. Blender, to its credit, does have some blending tools inside of it as well. This widget only will show up in the viewport. You can't put it anywhere else, but it will affect keys. If you have certain keys selected in the graph editor, it'll work on the graph editor. But just for UI reasons, it has to live somewhere in your viewport. So then we have the trails and then pivot. So the pivot is also kind of like Animbot's temp pivot, but it's a few more steps. There's an edit phase and a pose phase. But similarly, you go to edit, put it where you want it. You can go to pose and pose it, but you actually always have access to the pivot, rotation or movement versus the original center point. So it's kind of interesting to have them both, but it's there, and they update as the thing is animating. So it's all pretty well done. It's just a little bit clunkier. And then also in the rest of this panel is more settings for like, if you really need to see extra features in here. Proxy controls are something I'm not going to go over because I didn't have any to show you, but they're very cool. It's like basically like a live temporary rig, like a different way to interact with your rig. It's really cool. These are all pretty self-explanatory. And then we have spaces and constraints. So I don't think I do jump into these into more detail later. So this is a panel where you'll see all of the spaces that are relevant to the thing you have selected. So you can see here I have the foot selected. By default, this rig comes with a parent space, which is probably the global controller. World space, which is like true world, like completely detached from your rig. You could get in trouble here because if you do this to an FK controller, it will now no longer be following the rig. Like that arm will be just ripped off. So be careful. That is like true world. Like ignore the rig. Body space, hip space. Unlike Maya though, where if you switch a space that's built into your rig, it'll just kind of jack up all of your animation. Unreal is running a compensation. So anytime you change a space, it'll automatically convert all of your keys to that space, which is really great. And I'll get into that into a bit, but it's awesome. That's here. And this is also where you're going to do constraints, and I'll get into that as well, because constraints are also the same, but different. I would probably say that for 90% of you, this is what you always wanted a constraint to be. Very simple, very clean, and a little bit of black magic. You go to the frame that you want the constraint to start on. So here's like a dumb little animation, right? Arm is moving, box is falling down. You go to the frame where you want it to be constrained. You select the thing that you want to have be constrained. You go to this little tool on the little plus side. You go back a little bit. You hit this plus. You get these options for the different types of constraint. Come back. So you can do adjusted translation, which is like a point constraint, orientation constraint, scale, or parent. Parent is the normal one you're going to do. There is also a look at, which is another advanced technique, but really cool because of the way that this works. So you'll see in the graph editor as I do this. It's an eyedropper function. You can't pre-select them like you can in Maya. But you'll see that the curves just kind of did this jump. So it's automatically compensated the keys and there's no snap. The other thing to keep in mind is that unlike Maya or Motion Builder will get you into trouble because it doesn't necessarily lock the thing that's constrained. You can start to move it around, but it's just moving that offset, which is like really dangerous. And I don't know why in this demo it was setting funky keys down there, but let's ignore that. You can animate something while it's constrained safely in Unreal, which is like very different. So here I'm showing, look, it's still constrained, but I have animated it while it's constrained to that hand controller, which is really unique. And then you'll also see here this constant compensation that's going on. This button here is where you could deactivate a constraint. So you can see the curve goes and it drops down because it's made this new constraint point. And then I'm going to turn it off on this frame. So boom, you click and it is literally that fast. Whoa, not that. Go back. I wanted to still show it. Didn't realize the video just stopped right there. So it is that fast. It just like compensates, boom. The one little gotcha with this is it is technically setting a double key, right? So you've probably run into this in Maya when you're moving keys around and stuff. That's the way that they're making that work, right? So that curve goes up into that constraint frame, and on like the constraint frame, like the frame before, like 0.9999999, that frame before, it's setting a key to preserve that value, and then it sets the new value. But it is always compensating, and it's really handy because then you don't have any like pop frames. It just is there. And if you change that frame to where it's connected and you just hit keyframe, it's going to update the keys. So you can also do a lot of space switching stuff, which is very like Richard Lico style animation, which if you don't know him, look him up because you should know him. So we've got some things like I showed you earlier where like some controls have, depending on how your rig was set up, different spaces built in, but you can also always hit this little plus sign. I don't demo it, but you can hit the plus sign and create a custom space. So if, for instance, you have a character who's putting their hand on their head, and you just want that hand to follow the head, but your rig didn't come with an IK hand head space, right? You can just select the IK hand, and go to the spaces, pick the head, and then you can go to that frame and just convert it into that headspace. But here I'm demoing like the most common use of the space switching is you have a character that's maybe doing like a walk cycle and you're sliding them forward and you want to detach them from the root controller. Literally, you can just hit tab in the viewport and it will pop open this little thing and you can switch the space. It switches on the frame that you were on, so you have to kind of keep that in mind. It's not going to do the whole scene. It's going to do from your current frame forward. So that's what this is down here. You can see that world track shows up. But yeah, you just click and boom, it's converted. It's like super quick. I've taken a little bit of taken it for granted lately. But you can see now like the feet are stuck to the world. The move all is still moving the hips. So I can just quickly tap that into the world space and then I can delete the keys off of that mover controller and the feet and the body are disconnected. So it's really quick. I mean, I did it in stages, but you can just do it all at once and just pop into world space, delete the thing. It's a really cool and powerful way to work. And both the spaces and the constraints do the whole conversion stuff. So you can do a lot of Richard Leco style stuff between aim spaces and world space baking back and forth with just a click, which is like pretty great. One thing you won't have that might make you nervous is there's no play blast button. It made me very confused and concerned for quite a while, but it's fine. We have ways to record because like, you know, you're going to need to if you are just showing for dailies probably, or if you're in a linear content situation, you're going to need some sort of like a video to put into an edit. We have ways to do that. It's just not the same as like a Maya Play Blast, which is quick and easy. Boom, you just hit a hotkey, right? But part of that is because this is a game engine and things are running mostly at real time, better than Maya does. So similar to like Motion Builder. If you're working on Motion Builder and it's like you're used to things always running at real time, you know you don't need to play blast all the time to just check your work. You can just look at it and it's playing in real time. So, and I'll show you some tricks later that come with that that are nice. But it's hacky, but I wasn't, and I'm not a streamer, so this was all new to me too. But you can use OBS. Just capture video off of your screen. It's pretty straightforward, works. And also there's not a better way that I know of to capture in-engine stuff. So if you are doing gameplay animation, you need to test how it looks in game and show that, you're going to have some sort of screen recording. But it works, you know, and you can set hotkeys inside of OBS. So I have like a button press on my keyboard to just like, as long as OBS is open, I just hit it, boom, it starts recording, boom, stop, boom, I have a video ready to show. So it's not too bad. It's actually, then it's a lot faster than play blasting. There's also is the movie render queue. So like I said before, you could click that button and it'll make the cine cameras, and you'll see when you hit that button, it made the little lightning bolt, which means that camera is going to stay in the level sequence. You can dial in the camera however you want it. Right here, you're going to see, like, I'm going to just quickly frame it up. Use these things to drag the focus. You know, it's not autofocus like in Maya. Like, this is like an actual camera. Just kind of dial that stuff in. Boom, boom, boom. Maybe set some keys. This is some beautiful camera work here, guys. They'll be super impressed. But again, you're not going to find it. You're going to look it up and you're going to find, oh, cool, it's something called movie render queue. Well, where is that? It's not here. It's not anywhere. You actually have to go into the plugin manager, which it's funny. I keep saying Blender, but it is similar to Blender. Like Blender out of the box doesn't have a whole lot of stuff, but it actually comes pre-packaged with plugins that you can just load in, right? So you go in here, you type movie render queue, check the box, boom. Now it's loaded. Well, it has to restart. So here it's like, yo, you got to restart to get it. I'll restart real quick. Back up, reopen my level. It's got my camera in there. If I click on the little camera icon, it will pop my viewport into that camera. If you click on it again, it ejects you to the perspective. The cameras are important because unlike Maya comes, you have like perspective, front, back, all the ortho cameras. And technically you can play blast out of whatever's just actively running. Well, those cameras exist. So in this, I didn't really cover it. In this little thing here, there's perspective, there's the front, left, right, ortho views, but they're not renderable cameras. They're just viewport cameras. I don't know how to explain it better. So you need to actually have a camera in your scene because you're going to have to tag that into the movie render queue. Or the movie render queue needs that to know what to render. But from there, it's literally you just open that, like I just did that really quickly. Open the content browser and just drag the level sequence in. Fill out the details. It's pretty straightforward. There are settings that you can preset into a config file. This is where it's going to output the render. You do have to tell it the world to render it in, because this is where, like, if I'm working in a basic map, but I really want to have a nice render with like some specific lighting that I wasn't working in, you can pick that instead, and it will render it in whatever you pick here. But for this case, I just picked the same untitled world that I was in. Easy peasy, click render remote, and this is all unedited here. It's pretty quick. The render local versus remote really aren't different. It's like the remote isn't like rendering, it's just like doing a batch process basically. Like, I'm pretty sure you could just go back to working and this is just going to start running. But I didn't super test that. But you can see boom, and now it's running. And there's the output. So yeah, that boot up and all that extra time, it's longer than a play blast, but you're not going to be doing it as often as you will be doing play blasts, as you do play blasts in Maya. So some pros and some cons. And now we're running near the end of the time, so perfect. So here's some tricks that you can do. This one you're probably not going to do a whole lot. I could imagine maybe this is fun for some previs or to experiment really quickly. You can do mouse recording. Hold on a second, my dog is going to stop. Sorry, it's meal time, so the dog's barking. But yeah, so you can record the mouse. Like, there's no extra plugin that you need. You just literally grab a controller, and while it's grabbed, hit play, and it's just going to play forward and record wherever you put the mouse, which could be cool to experiment with different timings if you wanted to do that. Something that you will probably use a lot once you get used to is this, that it's always live running. Like you can see here on the left, yes, I can hit play in Maya and start tweaking curves, but anytime I touch a key, it will pause wherever it's at. But in Unreal, I can tweak that curve and it's editing live. It's not stopping, and I can immediately see that value or timing shift, which is actually a really cool speed boost to your workflow, to just be able to trust that you can just, here I'm even animating this little double bounce at the end. I could tweak how close those keys are, how far they are away, and never have to stop playing. I could just keep playing on loop and just kind of grab that key and focus on my viewport and just tweak the value, tweak the timing, and just feel it out so much quicker, so much better iteration. And without the viewport pausing. And if you can also just duplicate these tracks really easily. If you're like, hey, I really like this, I want to save it, and I want to try something different. So I want to try a different timing here. You can just hit duplicate, and you can kind of treat them like takes, like you would in Motion Builder. And just kind of, you have to mute the track. So then the one that's unmuted, I obviously didn't lock that, so I accidentally grabbed the wrong keys, but I can mute that other track and I can test, what does it look like with this faster timing? Maybe that didn't work. I can just trash that take, or I can go back and toggle between the two to compare them. Or I could like save a bit of animation for later. Like, oh, you know what? This is going to be some handy animation to keep. I can just duplicate it, store it, mute it somewhere else. So there's other new ways you can think about how you work and iterate that you can't do in other softwares because of the way that all of this functions. And you can see like duplicating these tracks is like that. Everything's so fast. So that's really nice. And there's heaps more, but I'm probably already overwhelmed and or bored you all. So welcome to transitioning to animation in Engine. As you can tell, a lot of it's the same, but a little bit different.